All right. I am here with Eric Liu. Eric, I'm so grateful to you for joining me today.
I'm so glad we get to do this.
Likewise. Let's just start by having you introduce yourself. Maybe tell us a little bit about Citizen University and maybe a little bit about how you came to see citizenship as so important.
Thank you for having me. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Citizen University, and we're a national nonprofit organization whose work is all about building a culture of powerful, responsible citizenship in the United States. And our work really emphasizes the culture side. They're obviously in this time right now in discussions about democracy, there's a lot of attention paid to structure, to policy, to structural reform and change, and or constitutional threats or challenges, which I'm sure we'll get into. And those are important. And we feel like culture precedes structure, and that the values, norms, narratives, habits, rituals that shape and define how we live together and what we think is normal and okay in how we live together, all of that forms the kind of environment, the frame of the possible within which structural political change happens. And so, to put it very concretely, we think about citizenship in our work often in this very simple equation, which is power plus character equals citizenship. That to live like a citizen, and I mean like a contributing member of the body. I'm not talking about, in this context, United States citizenship, documentation status, but more this bigger ethical conception, being a pro-social member of a community. That requires both a literacy in power, an understanding of what power is, how it works, how it flows, in what ways we have it and practice it, in what ways we do not. And then to couple that literacy in power with a grounding in civic character, a set of values and norms and habits that are about living together in community, that aren't just focused on the self or the now, and that both these things have to be cultivated. Neither of them happens automatically, and that you can't have a sustained democratic republic without people having been grounded in both power and character. And so a lot of our programs are simply about that equation and about teaching civic power and cultivating civic character.
Thanks for that. So one thing that I'm fascinated by, when you talk about culture, I think a lot of people, they get nervous when you talk about changing culture, partly because it's just so daunting. How do you change culture? And I guess I'm just wondering, how do you think about that problem? People, I think when they're like, oh, maybe institutions are like, oh, well, we could, if we lobby enough, we could get our congressperson to pass a particular law, and so maybe that's the best lever of change. And then when you start talking about culture, it's just so amorphous, so all-encompassing, so all-consuming that the idea of changing it feels almost impossible. I'm just wondering, how do you make sense of this deep issue of how we actually change culture?
I mean, it is as impossible as a spiritual change in a society. It is as impossible as a new wave of entertainment. It is as impossible as norms of parenting shift, which is to say it's totally possible. It's just not possible for you to have a recipe and a formula that says, here is immediately how I change the culture of the United States. And I think the thing that we emphasize is that the way to take this big abstraction of civic culture into a form that actually is manageable and tangible is to root it in place. You can think about the culture of New Orleans. You can tell me a lot about the culture of New Orleans right now, right? I mean, you could talk to long-timers there who could tell you about the culture of New Orleans and how it's stayed the same and changed in different ways over the last, let's just say, since Katrina, but maybe say over the last 50 years, right? And there are through lines of continuity and there are disruptions, partly because of natural disaster and response to it, partly because of newcomers like you, partly because of all these different changes that happen in any community. But you can get your arms around that. And you can think about, if you wanted New Orleans to be a place where there was a heightened civic culture of participation, of showing up, of service, you could identify certain people, institutions, practices, networks, rituals, gatherings that you might want to, spark or add rocket fuel to that are happening all the time in a place like New Orleans. And if you wanted to kind of make it even more tangible, pick the 7th Ward or the 9th Ward or whatever it is, and just like get down to a, that human scale. Anybody who thinks about culture in a bounded way realizes how it is the X factor, right? The difference between a successful sports team and an unsuccessful one, a successful musical group and an unsuccessful one, a successful university or corporation often boils down to a culture. And yes, that can be turned into a very abstract, dry, here's a PowerPoint on how to fix the culture of corporate organization X or Y. But when we live in relationship in a place and are grounded in the history of that place and see people in their full complexity, and invite them to see us in our full complexity, and then show up and actually not be a spectator or a passerby to your own community or city, but rather a co-creator of it, then you realize rather quickly how much power you do have to change the culture of it. For anybody who's unhappy about the state of American politics right now, I would point to that as an exhibit of how you're unhappy because a group of people over the last 3-4 decades have changed the culture of both the United States, but also of a whole set of institutions and of places and communities around the United States. And if you consider that a negative example, I would simply invite you to invert it and ask, well, what can I learn from this? And if you're happy about the direction of the United States, then it's proof, then it's proof of what I'm saying, that culture is not some unchangeable amorphous thing. It is literally how we live together. And the challenge, I think, that is greater than the seeming scope of the topic is rather that we don't actually see each other anymore. We literally don't. We see each other in mediated ways with our screens between us, our phones between us, and we also don't actually move into public space in the public square in anything like a serendipitous way that allows us to encounter each other in a community, and that is culture killing. And when we become isolated, atomized, disconnected from one another and from the place where we live, then we are ripe for exploitation, and that's happening right now.
Yeah, I love that. I also sometimes think about the idea, sort of what you alluded to, that when people say, "Oh, how could we possibly change culture?" Culture is going to change. It's constantly changing. The question is not whether it's going to change. The question is how. And so, to the extent that we have any control or agency over that, I think that helps to frame the question in a different way.
Yeah, look, I think it's we have so much agency, and you are right. Culture is changing all the time, but the question is simple. Every place has a civic culture, period. The only question is, do you want it to be a healthy or an unhealthy one, an adaptive or a maladaptive one, right? There are plenty of places in America where the civic culture is keep to yourself, don't know your neighbors, get what you can. It's, every man for himself, cut each other off in traffic, don't help out the person who looks like they're hurting, don't bother revealing anything about yourself because it will be used against you. And that's how people live. And that's a place that is going to be very brittle in the face of disaster. That's going to be a place that cannot handle change and adaptation, whether it's big economic change or other changes, climate changes. But the places where people have a healthier civic culture of knowing, seeing, serving, circulating their power, contributing, exchanging ideas and experiences, and reckoning with the good of the whole, that's a place that's going to last longer and be more adaptive and able to adapt to change. And I think that's and by the way, there's no Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative tilt to that. There are plenty of progressive places that are in that unhealthy category, and plenty of conservative places that are in the healthy category, and vice versa. But I think the choice is one of whether we really imagine ourselves to be in a community. I live in a city, Seattle, right now, that has changed dramatically in the quarter century that I've lived here. Even when I came here, it was digesting one big wave of changes from kind of what you can think of as the first tech boom, the Microsoft era. And then, when I got here, it was the dot-com boom. And what had been a very, Scandinavian, Asian in its culture kind of place, very communal, very collectivist, very passive aggressive and not directly confrontational, but indirect, changed and very kind of egalitarian. People didn't flaunt wealth, even where there was wealth. People who had wealth tried to flaunt service, tried to show ways in which they were contributing to the community. And over these ensuing 25 years, that has changed in the second and third waves of a tech boom, of Amazon, of, other companies like that. And now you have both great concentrations of wealth, but also a huge influx of newcomers who were not socialized into the old civic culture of this place. The old civic culture of this place was one where you could just show up and start doing things, and you were also expected to show up and start doing things and participating and joining your neighborhood council or knowing about your neighborhood library branch or so forth. And that has evaporated somewhat. And so,
It's like
I have a
norms.
responsibility in Seattle to help change the culture in the direction that I want to see it change.
Yeah, right. That I think is something that we've been thinking a lot about at the Beacon Project, is this idea of norms and expectations, how expectations for yourself and for the people around you, and what those. There's some fascinating research on how norms evolve and how they get transmitted and how they get upheld and all of that, and I think that right. So culture is this sort of collection of individually held sets of values and norms that people hold and they hold themselves to, and then get sort of passively transmitted to the people around them through things like language and concepts and
sometimes actively. I mean,
yeah.
But yeah, for sure passively and for sure by example. One of our core teachings at Citizen University is society becomes how you behave. And that sentence might seem unobjectionable or not notable at first, but when you stop and think about it, it is radically countercultural in the United States. That because we live in a culture in this country where the background assumption is everybody gets to do whatever the hell they want, and a million selfish acts will somehow roll up into a common good. And if I'm sociopathic or a jerk or whatever, someone else will be kind and altruistic, and it'll net out. But anyway, in either direction, it's my choice. Don't tell me what to do or how to be. Don't tread on me, right? And that deep cultural DNA we have, which you've written about, and Beacon Project has done interesting research about, is contrary to the idea that actually my norms, my choices, my omissions, my small acts of courtesy or discourtesy, compassion or lack of compassion, engagement or disengagement, are not just my own to be prized as my own liberty, but are rapidly contagious. And we've been saying society becomes how you behave long before the pandemic, but the pandemic proved it. And it proved it for a moment in a positive pro-social way, and then it proved it, lastingly ever since then in anti-social ways, right? But I think the norms are as contagious as pathogens, but they're also as contagious as something positive, as love. and I think as hope. And I think that's the thing that, so it's not only a matter of passively receiving what might be ambient in the air, but thinking about from where I sit, am I a node of any kind of network? It doesn't have to be some big, powerful network. Am I part of a church group? Am I a parent in a sports league? Am I a neighbor who knows at least 3 other neighbors? And can I there set in motion some small cascade of norms that starts moving us in this direction of show up instead of not showing up, participate instead of not participating, think in positive sum terms instead of zero sum terms when it comes to, questions of housing or whatever it might be that, is a local issue, but that we can set in motion those kinds of contagions for good and for ill in the circles that we move in.
Yeah, that's totally resonates. And I was just, thinking about this. This might take us into a sort of a nerdy tangent, but just thinking about what it was about the sort of the middle of the, historically, what has led to this sort of putting on a pedestal these ideas of radical individualism, that we have this idea from sort of liberal and neoliberal thinking that the collective good just emerges as a indirect consequence of the pursuit of one's self-interest, and that you should just let people sort of pursue their interests, and the invisible hand will cause all these these benefits to accrue without us having to actively try to pursue them. And my understanding, and tell me if you think this is the right interpretation. My understanding is that this sort of set of ideas emerged a little bit as a reaction to this idea of sort of centralization of, sort of like suspicion of any sort of centralized authority telling people what to do. And so the alternative, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction with thinkers like Milton Friedman and many of these other economists in the 20th century. But I think that they were missing this idea of culture. I just don't think they had maybe like the language, or I don't know exactly what it was, but they seem to miss the idea that there are ways of enhancing and cultivating this idea of mutuality, this idea of obligation to each other, and a transcendent sort of focus on the other as well as in addition to the self, and they seem to miss the power of norms and these sort of softer forms of sustaining these types of patterns of behaviors in network in a way, because they just seem to be focused on like the government and the state and the individual without these sort of intermediary sort of softer forms of enforcing and promoting certain behaviors. Do you agree with that interpretation, or do you have a different take?
I broadly agree, although I actually think the catalytic generation of people that even preceded Milton Friedman, like Friedrich Hayek, actually had plenty to say about culture and norms. Friedman, even to a certain extent, Friedman became a little bit more of an ideologue than a what you might think of as a social civic philosopher. He had more of an agenda, as you kind of suggest, against state overreach and centralization of government power. Hayek had a more, Karl Popper, Popper had a much more textured idea that there is always an interplay between individual appetites and self-interest on the one hand, and collective well-being, on the other. And you quote the invisible hand. You talk about these things. I mean, Adam Smith himself. People don't read Adam Smith. They only quote Adam Smith. But people who read Adam Smith generally only read half of him. They read The Wealth of Nations and talk about, his mechanistic description of the kind of perfection of the division of labor and the invisible hand of the market to allocate resources in the right way, so that you don't need kind of intrusive government to direct resources. But they don't read his other companion book, which was The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Great book.
Which is a great book.
And so readable.
It's so readable, and it's so pertinent right now, because he's basically saying, without moral sentiments of what he called benevolence, what we would call mutuality and reciprocity, what Alexis de Tocqueville would call 100 years later, 50 years later, self-interest properly understood. That without that, markets will collapse. That you can only have a market if you have a prior culture of trust, and you can only have trust where you have a prior culture that is relational and about what all those writers spoke of as affection, which didn't mean like I like you, Daniel. It meant like, civically, I love you as my neighbor and fellow citizen, and we will do this thing together. And where we can transact business that's mutually beneficial, great. Where we must be in argumentative political combat, so be it. But we are still bound together in a whole, right? So a lot of the philosophers of this stuff saw the integration. It's more the hacks, the politicians and the political ideologues who distorted some of this textured thinking for ends that were more, ideological and materially driven, that I think oversimplified these narratives and now have just boiled down to this cult of hyper-individualistic thinking and behavior. It's not, people like you and me going on these civic nerd detours overestimate the power of ideas. We should not underestimate the power of material, technological, and media changes, right? Our whole culture over the last century, our media environment has gone from mass to fragmented to now hyper-individualized, tailored. And so, as we consume ideas, information, and popular culture in these tiny little bubbles cut off from one another, that too feeds a wider civic culture of self-seeking and hyper-individualism and not thinking about mutuality or any kind of greater fabric that we're woven into.
Let's fast forward now to kind of more recent events and escape our little nerd circle there and go to things the nerd circle and go to maybe things that people will find more relevant. Although I maybe I have respect for my listeners. I think the people will be excited to hear that. So a few days after Charlie Kirk's assassination, you wrote a beautiful post on LinkedIn. I'd like to quote just part of it. You wrote, "There are ways to relieve pain that involve inflicting it on others, and there are ways to relieve pain that involve solving problems with others, making sense of things together, and in the process making each other more wholly human." Can you elaborate on that and say a little bit how you're just approaching this moment of division in your own work?
I've been thinking and feeling a lot about pain and about grief and the intersection of personal grief and civic grief. And that's partly because of losses that I've experienced in my own life in recent years. I always name her because she was the co-founder of Citizen University, and that's my late wife, Sinead Kane, who was a theater artist and a creator, but also just a deep kind of civic imaginer. And in these years, it's been 2 years since she died, and just in this time, I've been so much more highly attuned to the currents of grief and loss and pain that are in our culture everywhere, right? I have been previously, but I feel it in a different way now and sense it in a different way. And what really began to crystallize for me is this very simple notion that actually all politics is pain relief. When you think about it, in any era, what politics promises people most of the time is some remedy for pain, loss, or grief. Now, the pain, loss, or grief may be real, or it may be imagined, it may be valid, it may be morally not praiseworthy, but make no distinctions there, right? I mean, the New Deal was pain relief. George Wallace was pain relief for a group of people in the South who felt threatened by the rise of the civil rights movement. I think every moment in American history where there has been great political change and upheaval like the one we are living in right now, the question, the old question used to be follow the money. Sure, follow the money, but I actually would say follow the pain. Where are the pain points in the body politic? And being attuned to that, being not attuned to that is a recipe for failing in politics, but also a recipe for just amplifying the divisions and the dehumanization that are unfolding in our times right now. Because what we have right now, and just to be very concrete, think about the sedimentary layers of pain in our civic life in 2025 right now. Pick your point. So many years after COVID, we still haven't grappled as a society with that experience and the consequences of that experience. We became so fractured by that experience that we've never, as a people, grieved that. We haven't grieved 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan that were subcontracted out to some tiny percentage of us. And the rest of us, thank you for your service, let them board airplanes first, but then we just move on with our lives. And then is it any accident what great proportion of veterans of these recent wars were at January 6th, were a part of this kind of angry political upheaval in our times right now? You think about the pain and the grief that preceded the murder of George Floyd, that kind of were amplified by the kind of all too brief reckoning that followed his murder, and now the backlash. That's layers of grief. If 40, 50 years of concentration of wealth in this country and essentially the evaporation of the American dream for the middle class, that is an incredible source of psychic pain of what I thought I was going to be, how I thought I was going to be able to provide for my family, what I thought my future might be, and the pain and the shame and the loss that goes with sometimes unnamed. And you have, political entrepreneurs who have good antenna, and they will sense that. And again, not to put them on equal moral planes. I like some of these people and I don't like some of these people, but the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, Mamdani, and others right now are all exhibits of what the culture will yield when we don't have healthy ways of naming and dealing with our pain and addressing it in some both cultural and then ultimately structural way to relieve the pain, right? And so it is everywhere right now. And so when Charlie Kirk was killed, it was a moment of reflection. Charlie Kirk rose to prominence in part by tapping into some of this pain, some of this status anxiety among young conservative men especially, whose place in society feels like it's in flux. He spoke to a pain of conservative students on campus who felt beleaguered and misunderstood or mocked by the kind of dominant liberal bent of their institutions. And so he could come onto a campus and dare people, prove me wrong. And he could just own the libs over and over again and create these great video clips and then create followings. And, he was a real interesting amalgam of things because he was contributing to some dehumanization, certainly in certain things that he said. But he was also creating containers for people to reconnect in relationship and his followers, right? But in both cases, he was speaking to pain. And in reflecting upon his assassination, I just thought, look, we still have a choice. Every one of us has a choice. And the choice is not the choice of, do I resolve my political differences in violence or not? That's the last order choice, right? Long before that is, do I choose to humanize somebody who is making me feel bad in this moment? Do I choose to humanize somebody I disagree with? Do I choose to humanize somebody even though that person doesn't choose to humanize me? And do I choose to remember that society becomes how you behave? And when I say humanize people, to humanize themselves and them and ourselves by asking what hurts. What hurts here that has led this person to behave this way? What hurts here that's leading me to respond in this way? And I know, if we were in civic nerdland before, now we're in like what sounds like therapy session. I'm not talking about just like big collective therapy sessions. I'm talking about being a grown up, being a clear eyed grown up citizen who can face yourself and not hide from yourself and not run from yourself and not sublimate what hurts or what is embarrassing or what is shameful or what is painful in your life into the abuse of others or into the scapegoating or dehumanization of others. And that happens across both the left and the right. We are in this coarsening and this dehumanization. And so that is the choice that I spoke about in that post, which turned into a newsletter that we sent out to our network at Citizen University. And, I think many people responded to it. Some people found it very dissatisfying because they wanted righteous fire at all of Charlie Kirk's, the malicious and hateful things that he did say in the course of his public life. While others from the right, friends of mine, were like, hey, people didn't join Charlie Kirk's movement because they were hurting. They joined because they had faith and they were happy. And why are you kind of pathologizing this, right? I'm not pathologizing it. I'm saying that if you're human, there's pain. And if we're humans in a collective, you got to look for where are the sources of collective pain that our leaders have not addressed in a healthy way. And instead of waiting for a leader to address in a healthy way, why don't we look to each other as citizens and members of the body and ask, what could I do to help name and then ease some of this suffering around me?
That's beautifully put, Eric. Do you see opportunities for people who, I guess this is a two-part question. Where do you see, aside from the litany of sources of pain that you mentioned in terms of, this beautiful image of sort of sedimentation, do you see areas of pain now that people who are civically engaged or in this who want to help to start to help to alleviate that pain, ways that they can be involved in that, or is it really on a case-by-case basis?
Oh, the problem is there are too many ways to get involved. And I think actually in this time right now, that's what we hear from people, like, I don't know where to start. What do I do? And that's true of even the most educated, privileged people who have plenty of capacity and networks and capital. They find themselves, they come to us at Citizen University as helpless as people with much less. And there is something that is stultifying or paralyzing about the kind of scale and simultaneity of crises that are unfolding right now. But our counsel at Citizen University is severalfold. Number one, focus where you live. Focus on place and people and experiences that are human. We're going to encounter people not in a mediated way. And that can be on super hyper local issues like, displacement because of gentrification or hunger, and food banks, or it can be dealing with the local consequences of national things, like the fact that ICE agents are now making many of your immigrant neighbors scared to go out, to go to school, to be in public space at all. Whatever it is, kind of identifying, first committing to place. Second, pick anything. Pick one thing right now, right? And don't feel like your one thing has to be the thing that meets the moment, right? It may be, if you live in a city where where protests are happening, that feels like the most kind of salient thing to worry about. But if actually what you are moved or called to do is to do something that is to work with kids who have autism and who do not have a pathway into public education, then be of use there and help organize parents and families there and just build a relational context where you live. Pick anything. And then once you've picked something, commit to it for the next 3, 6, 9 months. And this is where some of our programs, we've got a program called Live Like a Citizen that is literally about the steps you can take to build your civic power, to learn how to join and organize and read a map of power in a community and understand how you move ideas and people and money and so forth to kind of address collective desires. But like you don't have to go to our thing, our training. You can just pick something and get engaged on that. But the main thing is commit. Commit for a period of time during which relationships will form. If you just say, well, I care about this issue. I'm going to go to a meeting and see what the meeting's like. And then you find that meeting boring and you don't go to a second meeting, you haven't done anything. It's the second or the third or the fifth or the sixth meeting that actually builds the muscle and that actually relaxes the heart, and all the insecurity about, is this useful? Am I useful? Like, I don't know, right? When you keep seeing the same people over and they're like, Daniel, how you been? What's been going on?
Well, I feel really seen right now. I as someone who went to one meeting of my neighborhood association last year and was like, I'm going to get involved. And then how many meetings have I gone to since then? All right, I got it. You got it. You inspired me.
Look, and if others want, and if by contrast, you're like, no, I'm on fire about national politics. All I want to do is join a national organization or a local chapter of a national organization that is, working on these issues coming out of the Trump administration. Great. But I do think that in this time right now, presidents, I would say particularly this president, can break things from the top down, but only people rooted in community, committed to each other in relationship, can do the repair over time. And, if you don't like this president, the solution is not a better, yes, you might want a better president, come the next presidential election, but presidents don't fix things in this way. What is broken in our civic culture, if you're not a fan of Donald Trump, if he disappeared today, what is broken in our hearts, in our culture, in our communities, the dehumanization, the cynicism, the hardening that has happened all across the United States would still persist and would still require our recommitment and our engagement and simply our choice to see each other and be human again. And so I think that is that is the stuff in many ways the Beacon Project is all about, right? You're giving conceptual names to these patterns of behavior, and you are seeing the patterns as they unfold. But what is a pattern except a whole bunch of people choosing? And I think that, that is what we get to do still. And I think as much reason as there is to be feeling cynical or despairing about our times right now, I remain net hopeful that we can do this because, first of all, what choice do we have but remain net hopeful? But second of all, it is the act of remaining hopeful that itself is contagious and that itself becomes an attractor to other people who might want to go to the second neighborhood meeting. And when you go to that second one, you're going to meet somebody there for whom, this was their second one too. And they weren't so sure. And it's been a long time since they went to their first one. And now you can have a little pact. You can have a next steps pact, as I've said with a dear friend of mine who was feeling stuck in some of this kind of stuff. And you don't have to have a pact to solve New Orleans or solve America. Just let's agree. Let's take the next step together. And that's how it happens. Mm.
Wow, you really... I don't know. You could have been a preacher in a different life, Eric. Although you are a civic evangelist, right? Yeah, I think it's your description. Does it call a civic evangelist? Is that what you call yourself?
Well, yeah, and that's partly because I didn't even talk about this, but one of our earlier programs at Citizen University that kind of touches on all these aspects of place and culture and ritual and relationship is called Civic Saturdays. And these are gatherings that we catalyzed back in 2016 that are a civic analog to a faith gathering. So, it's not church or mosque or synagogue, but on purpose it has the structure and the arc and the feel of a faith gathering on purpose because it's reminding us that living in a democracy is not a one and done, if we got the right leader, then I can check out. Living in democracy is an act of perpetual mutual faith. Democracy only works if enough of us believe democracy works. And when enough of us stop believing it, you start feeling that cascade. You start feeling the crumbling of the thing. And And the way to shore up belief, because so many Americans have lost faith for reasons that we've identified, for the same reasons that there is so much grief in civic life, you can't scold somebody into belief. You can't say you should believe harder in democracy or you should care more about democracy. Don't you see our democracy's in trouble? What's wrong with you, right? That's a completely counterproductive way to approach stuff. Most people don't care about democracy. Most people care about being seen, respected, understood, powerful, or at least capable enough and have enough agency in their lives so they don't feel at the whim of forces greater than themselves. And most people would like to do that in a context that is decent and respectful of others and inclusive of others. That's most people in the United States. But you don't get there just by wishing it were so. And you certainly don't get there by yelling at people for not doing enough. And so you've got to create an invitation. And Civic Saturdays were one way to invite people into a ritual. Let's join, let's sing, let's read texts of civic scripture and actually remember what some of these promises were that we've failed to keep to each other. And then recommit, right? Now, if that feels too churchy for you, then make your own thing. You know, you're a jazz musician, make a civic jam session, make a gathering that's going to be a mix of, music and civic improvisation and people talking about where they're from and then, breaking bread, whatever, right? It's just like forming these kinds of circles, making these kinds of clubs, creating rituals or breathing new life into old rituals and old clubs. That's what we got to do right now. All those things, what I just described, equals, each of those things plus each of those things plus each of those things equals a healthy civic culture.
Yeah.
Right.
That I think is, you're so right. And I think that it actually, the challenge of it is that there's, I feel the sort of like secular, like millennial in me kind of being like, yeah, I agree, but like, but there's a kind of, there's an inherent almost skepticism or suspicion of these sorts of like touchy-feely like things, especially, but it's actually so interesting because there's simultaneously like a deep need. People like, this increased secularization, this increased detachment from religious institutions that's been well documented for the last 50 years. And then you see a commensurate decline in some of the indications of belonging and increases in loneliness and all these things. And at the same time, we're in a culture where, this idea of ritual, for example, which I think is such a critical thing that you touch on, is or collective, what I've studied as collective effervescence, right? This idea that of feeling part of something that's bigger than you. There's sort of the language, especially I think in more secular progressive circles, there's an inherent suspicion of these, I think, in part because of some well-learned lessons about the sort of dangers of organized religion and some of the kind of reasons that there has been a backlash against some of these more systematized forms of religion and ritual. And so I think that there's a weird sort of dissonance that's going on right now where this type of mutuality and transcendence is both deeply needed, but there's also an inherent suspicion of it in secular circles.
And yet at the same time, millennials and Gen Z are creating and in some cases rediscovering all different forms of joining and belonging and ritual. And they run the gamut from, it's fascinating in cities around the country right now, supper clubs are becoming a thing again, and mainly driven by people your age and younger. And they're not avowedly political or civic, and they're certainly not religious, but they do have a spirit to them, right? They're not just like potluck dinner. They are responding explicitly in many cases to the epidemic of loneliness and to the loss of any space where we can talk about shared fears and shared values. And so you have things like that. You have all kinds of kind of innovative nights out that are happening that do combine music and comedy and dating and other stuff, that are happening. You have Gen Z, groups rediscovering the benefits of malls and actually walking together in groups, to hang out at the mall and look at the tangible thing that you were wanting to buy, that you saw the ad for on Instagram, right?
Although that's been going on since the 90s. I know my wife can attest to that she was hanging out in groups in malls for many years.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was in the Stranger Things generation of, pioneering that kind of behavior in the 80s.
Okay, all right. You're the original.
Yeah, the OG mall,
mall
walker. But I think, you put your finger on a thing, which is, I don't mean when I'm talking about Civic Saturdays to only push this notion of civic religion as the way. That is one of the channels we have at Citizen University. We have other channels of programs that have nothing to do with that are much more about actually something that's equally resonant to a lot of your generation right now, and that is invitation into mutual aid circles. We run these mutual aid circles called civic collaboratories. We have a national one that you are part of, but then we've been seeding place-based ones in cities and communities around the country. And there are people who are hungry to not just join a group and not just join a club, but join a group where they're going to take turns helping each other on projects that they want to do in the community and initiatives they want to get off the ground or progress they want to make on a cause in a city. And that invitation, do you want to be part of something not only where you feel greater, not only the collective effervescence of being in something that's greater than yourself, but actually making something that's greater than yourself by actually serving and helping others, and then having that circulate back to you, right? That is getting traction in our work as well. And so I think, these modalities, whether they are avowedly civic like that or things like supper clubs and other groups that are emerging, are all this kind of, to go back to Adam Smith language, all a great civic market response to what is to the market failures of our institutional settings, right? People feel lonely and isolated. They feel cut off. They feel over-mediated. And there's enough of us now starting to want to remember the power of face-to-face engagement and continued commitment to a group that keeps meeting over time to build trust. And, we're still a tiny minority, but people who care about this kind of stuff. But so, I know millions of people will be listening to this first podcast, but at the end of the day, even people who listen to to this podcast are a minority of Americans. Like the thing to also remember when we go back to culture change is culture change is not an election. You don't need 50% plus one to get on board with you on a culture change. You just need to set in motion, by setting an example, a contagion of joining, a contagion of group forming, a contagion of, of getting value and social esteem by being a contributor rather than a consumer, right? So many of, I was formed by different institutions that shaped my sense of ritual and belonging. One, which in another conversation we could talk about, is the United States Marine Corps Officer Candidate School, which I went through when I was in college, and being shaped just during those 12 weeks there. I chose not to take a commission when I graduated, but those 12 weeks were incredibly formative for me over 2 summers in solidifying for me what I think I was already somewhat pre-wired for, which is wanting belonging in a ritual way that made you always feel like you were part of something. I mean, literally a core, a body, right? In French, greater than yourself, right? But so were the clubs and institutions I was part of when I was in college, right? All of which were formed during 2 centuries ago, basically, when there was a mania in the United States for club making and club formation, an absolute kind of talk about effervescence. It was just all over the country. Some of it was religious, this second great awakening, but most of it was secular. I mean, what we think of now as fraternities, all our big frats and sororities, like they all grew out of this kind of mania. They're the surviving kind of artifact of what used to be a much denser and thicker ecosystem of all kinds of student societies and groups and organizations on and off campus. And I just think that is the kind of revival that if enough of us commit to that, we can tip things in a way that will remind people what's possible when we see each other.
All right. Well, let's end it there, Eric. Thank you so much. Before we close, just wondering if there's anything that you're working on or that you'd like to direct listeners to that you're excited about right now.
I'll tell you about one thing I'm working on, and then one thing I would direct listeners to. I'm working on a book right now on how to live like a citizen, and it's not so much a here's how you vote and here's how you give a speech. It's much more kind of elemental verbs. How to see, how to listen, how to join, how to fail, how to argue. Some basic things that we, in this age of hyperpolarization and AI and social media and everything, we have forgotten how to be human. And this is a little bit of a rewind for us of how and why this matters. So that's what I'm working on. But that won't be out for a while. The thing I would point people to right now, actually, when I speak about civic culture, for the last few years, I've been co-chairing a project out of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a commission called Our Common Purpose. And one of our spin-off projects has been a project on civic culture and really putting meat on the bones of the idea. What do we mean by this? Why does it matter? How do you actually, to your opening question, how do you actually change civic culture where you live? And so we put together a group and we made this report, Habits of Heart and Mind, which is not really a report. It's more like a playbook that anybody can use, strategies for how to fortify the culture of your place, the civic culture of your place. And this thing it's only been out less than a year, but it has gotten traction in a lot of different environments. Academia for sure, but also philanthropy, also higher ed institutions. They did an initial run of 25,000 copies and it just went out. And now there's, second run. People are just, it's also available on PDF, so you can just Google it. I'm old enough to still like something I can put my hands on. But the PDF is great too. And I would point listeners to that because I think that is, that crystallizes some of what you and I have been talking about, Daniel. I think implicit in it is so much of the spirit and the meaning and the purpose of the Beacon Project and everything you and your teammates at More in Common do all the time. The seeking, the sensing, the sense making of these psychographic and emotional patterns in the body politic. And so I think anybody who's listening to this, I think will find Habits of Heart and Mind relevant and hopefully resonant.
I can definitely attest to that. I also have a copy about 2 feet away from me on the side there, and I also enjoy the hard copy. So, but it's a truly fantastic report. So I will double up on that. It's wonderful. One last question: is there any other person you would recommend that I speak to that you think would be interesting to talk to on topics like this?
A thought came to mind when we were talking, and you were speaking about how in predominantly progressive circles, people might be skeptical about things like Civic Saturday or civic religion and so forth. And that just underscored for me how so many of these conversations happen in left-dominant environments about everything we're talking about here, right? And some of my most valued, trusted friendships in the civic realm are partners and collaborators who are right of center, who also think about this stuff. And I would recommend 2, actually. Three. You know one of them well, but I'll save him for last. But one is Pete Peterson, who is the dean of the Public Policy School at Pepperdine. And then a second is Rich Taffel, who until recently was a member of my board at Citizen University. Decades ago, he was the founder of the Log Cabin Republicans, and he now runs a whole series of workshops on what he calls cultural translation, helping left understand the right and vice versa, as somebody who has moved, osmotically between both. And Pete and Rich together several years ago launched something at Pepperdine called the American Project, which articulated what they called a conservatism of connection. So back to our earlier nerd out about kind of the rise of hyper-individualistic, liberalism, classical liberalism. They articulated what I think of as a really meaningful sweet spot. That is an articulation of a conservatism that is about, that does not worship markets above all, that is about connection, about faith, family, and belonging, and friendship, and about civic culture, and why a philosophy that's only about market individualism is harmful. But they don't go as far as some others do right now on the right, toward then wanting like a theocratic state to, direct our moral formation.
Right.
They're just much more in a Tocquevillian sense about, reactivating that James Q. Wilson spirit, that James Davison Hunter spirit of, how do small c conservatives, people who want to take responsibility for themselves and others first before having to wait on or rely on a state to do so. They articulated something very powerful in this conservatism of connection work, and I think it's a good another facet of what you and I have been talking about here.
Wonderful. Oh, beautiful. Well, I look forward to checking out the work. I hadn't heard of either of them, so that will be
well, and they both,
my next,
Daniel
my
Stid
next
is the
homework
third
assignment.
person, of course.
Yes, Mr. Stid.
So,
Dr. Stid.
Dr. Stid, at American Enterprise Institute, who's great,
Wonderful. Yes. Well, he is the chair of our board at More in Common, and I would love to have him on the podcast as well. So, Eric, it has been an absolute pleasure. I truly enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for being the first of hopefully many guests on this. I guess it's a show. I don't really know. I don't know
this
what to
show
call it yet, but
this hangout, this civic
hangout.
hangout. Daniel, I'm really honored, truly, that you asked me to be first, and I just really. This is just our listeners may not know, but hopefully they can sense that this is just like a middle segment of a long-running conversation that began, not that long ago, and hopefully will extend for years to come. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Eric. Likewise. Okay.